My name is Mohamad Machine-Chian. Thank you for attending this webinar. I'm going to talk about Islamic banking, or as the legislature named it, anti-usury banking system in Iran. We've been using this scheme for the past nearly 40 years. Even though it was supposed to be used in a trial period of 5 years, but I will get to that a little later. I'm sure to begin with, a lot of you, or some of you at least, are interested to know a little more about the current climate in Iran, and it is relevant to our talk today, I should say, because Iran is not, people of Iran, let me put it like that, people of Iran are not having the best days. And most of it, at least some of it, is due to the banking system. And for that reason, I think we couldn't choose a better time to talk about this. I will just provide a couple of examples and briefly just touch on the current situation. The IR real is falling, is free falling, I should say, and the inflation is going up fast. In fact, according to a lot of economists, including Johns Hopkins' Steve Hanke, who is focused actually on inflation and has been studying the Iranian system as well as Venezuela and other places, Zimbabwe, that sort of thing. According to him, we are going towards hyperinflation. I should add to that we also have a stagnation. So we currently have a stagflation, and we are going towards a hyperstagflation, which is quite an achievement, actually. And some of it is, again, due to our banking system. I'm not going too deep on the monetary policy and the central banking, that sort of things. It probably requires its own time. But I will say this, that only in the past 15 years, and which comes about the time that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected, up until now, the money supply has grown up 25 times over, and it is rising fast and fast. So in the past couple of weeks, in the past week actually, I can even that far, in the past week, Iranian real has lost more than close to 60% of its value just past week. And so in the past 3 or 4 months, I'm not going to even calculate the number, but it's horrifying. And a lot of people have lost all their savings, and the money becomes more and more irrelevant. So I'm not sure if in a few months we still can use this, and people are worried that we are going towards another Venezuela, and we have a lot of similarities. There are a lot of similarities between the two countries, unfortunately, at the moment. I can also touch briefly on the financial institutions. We have a lot of bankrupted financial institutions. Banks are not getting bankrupt in Iran, ironically, in the sense that all of them are or have been bankrupted for the past decade or so. But the government cannot declare them bankrupt because it will have some implications, and political, that is, and financial, of course. So politically speaking, it is unfeasible to declare them bankrupt. However, we had a lot of other financial institutions, all of which almost have been declared bankrupted, and the government bailed them out, needless to say, as governments do in these sorts of situations. So, which, by the way, added to the injury and worsened the situation. And the banking system isn't showing any signs of improvement. So, with that introduction, let's get to the topic at hand. And let me start by saying that the Iranian experiment has been a failure. So let me be very clear. That is the first sentence I'm going to say about Iranian Islamic banking. And we will, of course, talk about as to how and why. And of course, there are those who still try to justify it or to blame political or international situations for this failure. Well, it is commonplace to blame America, UK, West in general, for these sorts of failings. But even the apologists agree that the Islamic banking in Iran has not been successful. And I believe there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this. So I won't talk about activities that can maybe called banking in ancient times, in the Persian Empire, that is. I will try to focus more on the contemporary era and point out only important information if relevant to our talk today. And even then, we're not going to get too deep on the history. It is just, I think, important to mention that the first bank in modern Iran reached about 140 years ago. And it happened to be a private bank, privately owned entirely. And it did not seek and did not receive government license or approval of any kind. So at the time, the central government was not as powerful and there wasn't any regulations about this. So they just established a bank and started working. Before that, of course, there had been attempts to convince the Shah. They tried, it was the time of Nasruddin Shah, the Qajar dynasty. They tried to convince him that bank is a good thing and has some uses. The Royal Highness was not impressed and didn't feel like establishing one. But after that, after this private bank I mentioned before, there were some other banks which all of them were, by the way, private banks up until about I think 80 years ago. Then they established a bank called Sepah, which in Farsi, in Persian, means army. It was to finance and organize military efforts. After that, they established a national bank, or Milli Bank, and they gave that Milli Bank the authority to print bills. The first regulatory law that addressed banking, this is also, I think, important, was enacted close to 90 years ago. So why that is interesting or relevant? Because in writing those statutes and laws, Islamic religious authorities, religious leaders, I should say, they participated actually. They weren't heavily involved, but they were watchful. And up until then, by then, I mean, ever since the first bank was established in Iran, up until the revolution, usually were practiced in Iran, and of course was frowned upon. At the time of these things all coming together, mujtahids and religious leaders, I mean, were quite influential at that time. And we have a lot of instances to demonstrate this. For example, at some point, mujtahids decided tobacco was forbidden, was haram. It was a political thing, and they decided that is the case, and people stopped using tobacco. It mustn't have been very easy, but they did it, and it worked. Another instance, they forbade the usage of sugar, and again, people stopped using sugar until the problem resolved itself, and they allowed using sugar again. So they were involved heavily in the society, and they were respected. And at the time of writing those laws, they were watchful. So if a law is against Islam, they would act it immediately. They would rally people against it. And that was the extent of their involvement. They have been, of course, we know this, they have been consulted about these laws in advance to prevent any problems. At the time, loan sharks aside, there were loan sharks. Of course, there was usury practice, and as I mentioned, it was frowned upon. But to believer, lending money was quite commonplace, obviously. And they would consider the value of time to provide incentive to get their money back sooner than later. Just as someone would lend their carriage, for example, to someone. Someone would lend their land for agricultural purposes to someone else. Lending money was the same, and compensation was for a certain period of time also was commonplace. So interest, lending money, interest, it wasn't conceived as usury. Usury was considered to be when someone charged a rate of 3 to 4 times the usual rate. As I will mention later, usury has 2 trademarks. One, it is usually cruel and unreasonable. So lending a loan, again, is not considered to be usury. But lending money with cruel and unreasonable cruel intentions and unreasonable rates, that would be considered to be usury. And I'm not trying to incite debate about this, and but that is how it was perceived at the time by the believer. And those, by the way, Bazar at that time was very religious. And these people that lend money to each other and charge interest, and the interest was close to 5%, 5 to 7%. The reasonable rate was 5 to 10%. These people were very religious, and they would close shops 2 times a day to attend prayers, and they were very close to religious leaders. And a lot of, and the Shia Muslims, as you probably have heard or know, have a lot of rituals and that sort of things. And these traditions and rituals would not survive if it wasn't for the support of the Bazar. So the Bazar would financially support every religious effort, and when the religious leaders would ask them or encourage them to do something, they would. But nevertheless, at the same time, lending money with interest was going on very reasonably. In conclusion, I think I can say with confidence that modern economics were accepted and understood in a traditional setting and got along very well with the religious teachings of Islam. That was the case for a long, long time. In fact, up until the revolution of 1979, we had 100 years of banking this way. And we never had any problems. And well, we had conventional banking, we had reasonable rates, and religious leaders had nothing against it. But I should pause here to add a little context, without which the U-turn of ideas and practices after the revolution especially would seem puzzling, perhaps. After the revolution of 1917, for the past 101 years, actually, Iran has been influenced quite forcefully at times by its neighbor, the socialist Soviet Union, and, well, the Russia afterwards. We can see this influence in arts and literature. Almost every novel, perhaps aside from a handful, written in the past century in Iran can be easily mistaken by a Russian novel, for example. Well, maybe not as good, but still. If you change the name of the author, you wouldn't probably able to tell if this is a Persian novel or a Russian novel, even though we have a very rich history of literature, and Persian language has a long history, as you probably know. But it was so influential, people abandoned those traditions in favor of the new trend. For another example, during the war between Iran and Iraq, there was an emergence of a new form of paintings, which was very reminiscent of communist propaganda posters. And they have been covered extensively by especially by the Western media, to portray a less than pleasant picture of Iran, and rightfully so, unfortunately. So our art and literature was very much influenced, but those were not the only things. We also had, this is also important to note, that we had a lot of unrest and attempts for independence in Iran towards Russia, because the Soviet Union invested a lot of money and tried to seize some parts of Iran, and succeeded, by the way. Some parts of the current CIS belonged to Iran before that, including Georgia and some places. So, and another thing I think I can point out is all the communist literature. I think down to every pamphlet published by the Communist Party in Russia was readily available, has been readily available, still is readily available in Farsi. But on the other hand, it is interesting to know that you cannot find liberal literature, for example, that easily in Iran. Up until not long ago, you couldn't find something like something as classic as John Locke, let alone more recent thinkers. So I'm telling you this to understand what was going on during that time, which ended as I'm going to mention. So this started an intellectual movement, all of this. The new world brought about some new phenomena that I'm not going to get into too much detail. The height of this movement probably was Sayyid Jamal, who, let me put it like this. Some people thought that Islam was not providing all the answers to the new problems of the modern world, and there were attempts to provide Islamic answers, new answers, I should say. The height of these was Said Jamal. I'm not sure if the attendants have heard about him or not, uh, who wanted to use Islam to battle imperialism and Western ideas in general. To do so, he was seeking to add a more political approach to Islam, which ended up as the magnum opus of Ayatollah Khomeini, the doctrine of Velayat Faqih. The gist of it is that religion and politics should not be separated. They should, in fact, be merged together. And they are two sides of the same coin, and so on and so forth. Another case was Dr. Shariati. He went to France to study, and when he came back, he was a Muslim, he was a believer. He also was a socialist, and so he tried very hard to find a solution to. He tried so hard to find socialism in Islam. Let me put it like that, and he succeeded. So, and there were other intellectuals as well. I can go on about these people in length. So, one of the reasons, in my opinion, that happened was that in a traditional setting, in a Muslim community, for example, if you try to promote ideas you have picked up and brought back with you from the West, or, well, you'll come up with, in any case, it is hit or miss. People may or may not like your ideas and might not even listen to you. But if you promote your ideas, your new ideas, as new findings in Islam, in Islamic understanding, and accuse the believer of not understanding what Islam really is all about, well, then every Muslim will listen. They don't have any other choice but to listen to you. It also becomes dangerous to oppose or criticize your opinions. And because those opposing you are trying to defend the correct understanding of Islam. So that is why in that time we see the emergence of new kinds of Islam everywhere. And they call it modern Islam. They call it Islam and Nab, Nab being the prime Islam. That's something of that meaning. So very different new flavors of Islam. But in my opinion, at least, they were trying to market their own ideas, and that was it. They had some ideas. They had most of them. They had good intentions, of course. But with those good intentions, they marketed their own opinions as the position of Islam. And that is exactly what happened to our banking system. Two newly graduated students came back from the United States. They were graduated in America, and they were socialists at the time. They happened to be socialists. It was during the 60s and the Vietnam War and all the movements and so forth. And Shariati too, but by the way, Shariati was there in during the 1968 events of Paris. So, you know, it is obvious where these people got their ideas from. And so two people came back to Iran. They had their own ideas. They were young, they were inexperienced. They didn't have any prior reputation or anything. And if they provided their own opinion, if they published their own opinions, probably no one would have listened. So what they did is quite astonishing. And I would call them charlatans, actually. These two charlatans, they came up with an idea. they presented, they marketed their own ideas as Islamic. So they were against capitalism, they were against imperialism, you know, that rhetoric. So they came up with a system, with a socialist system. And since in their opinion, it was more close to equality and the whole rhetoric. I'm not going to repeat all the rhetoric. So they called it Islamic. What they did next was next level actually. So they went to see mujtahids, and at the time after the revolution, and by the way, the communists, socialists had long participated a great deal in the revolution of 1979 in Iran. And as I mentioned before, they were they had quite a big force in Iran before that. They were the biggest political party before the revolution. After the revolution, the Muslims, the Islamic leaning factions, which by the way had, let me put it like that, we had two kinds of communists. The atheist communists, more leaning towards Soviet Union, and Muslim communists and socialists. So these two were the biggest faction, political faction before the revolution, and both of them had something, if they had anything in common, was this. So they went to the mujtahids, and so the climate was quite receptive of this sort of ideas. These two relatively young economists went to the mujtahids and made their case. They told the mujtahids that the current system is rabawi, or is suffering from usury, and it is a capitalist system, and usury is haunting this Islamic Republic. And obviously the mujtahids at the time did not have a very deep knowledge of the banking system as it was. And it was just after the revolution, and they couldn't, in some cases, afford to talk against it. We have instances that some mujtahids, in fact, mujtahids were quite outspoken before, against these new understandings of these new flavors of Islam, like Shariati and Al Ahmad, that sort of things. But after a while, they were very popular, especially among young people. So the mujtahids started to concede the point. And even though some of them still continue to attack these new trends, many of them will quiet it down. Also, the revolution, as you probably know, a lot of religious leaders went into politics, and expediency and popularity became more important for the religious leaders. And we have, by the way, the doctrine of expediency at that time, which addressed a lot of problems. Whenever they faced a problem which was in opposed to the traditional understanding of Islam, they would plead the expediency and go around it for emergency purposes, that sort of things. So these two people went to the mujtahids and made their cases, and mujtahids told them that, well, if the current system is rabawi, if the current system suffers from usury, it shouldn't be that way, and we should find a system which is not rabawi, is not suffering from usury. And that was it. That was the whole. Mujtahid went this far. Mujtahid did not go into details, and they never said that the current system was rabawi. They didn't know it. They said if it is suffering from usury, then we should find something else. But in that political climate, they succeeded in submitting their own ideas, and they came up with this trial period of 5 years to see if the new banking system, the new Islamic banking system they had come up with, these two kids, it works, if it works or not. Needless to say, it did not work, but nearly 40 years later, excuse me, nearly 40 years later, we're still stuck with it. Now, allow me to talk a little more about this system, what it is. Sorry. Yes. So, first of all, the first thing they went for were the capitalists. Well, actually, before that, it was the private property thing. Most of the banks before the Islamic Revolution were private. So after the revolution, they thought the capitalists were owning these banks, and people should own it. Even though in Iran we have, well, Islam clearly is pro private property. There's no question about it. I can provide endless amount of evidence to support that. But nevertheless, as I mentioned before, they had their own flavor of Islam. So they made merged about 40 banks into 7 banks, 7 national banks, 7 government-owned banks, all of which are bankrupted as we speak, and for some time, for quite some time now, actually. So what was the characteristics of this system? First, it was owned by the government. It wasn't privately owned, and it was taken away from private property, which is quite un-Islamic to my understanding. The price fixing started. So the government started fixing the price of the interest rate. Before that, interest rate was set by the market. But after that, government started setting the rate, and a lot of politicians used that to buy popularity, of course. Again, it is very un-Islamic. Another thing was that introduction of the Qarz al-Hasaneh to for-profit banks, which sounds very good. Which, if you're for Islamic banking, or you prefer your banks to be Islamic, it sounds good for your bank to provide Qarz al-Hasaneh. But it's not a good idea, and this is, I think, one of those lessons, because you're forcing a for-profit institution into non-profit activities, and especially and by the way, we have been able to have private banks again in Iran in the past 15 years. So for the past 15 years, can you hear me?
Yes, okay.
Okay. So for the past 15 years, we've been having private banks, and the government forces all the banks, whether government-owned or privately owned banks, to these sorts of non-profit activities, which for the shareholder is again isn't very Islamic. Not to mention that the bank, when you try to lend your money as Qarz al-Hasaneh without interest, well, it should be used without interest. But the case is, as it happens in Iran, of course, the situation, the Iranian banking system, the way it works is that you deposit Qarz al-Hasaneh, and then the bank lends your money for profit, for interest. And by the way, the banks in Iran, and by the way, I'm receiving some notifications. I'm trying to figure out if something is wrong and I can do something about it. In any case, the banks, after becoming Islamic banks, still kept all the flaws in the conventional banking system. So they still charge interest. So it is a common mistake to think that since we have Islamic, quote unquote, Islamic banks in Iran, then they do not charge interest. That is not the case. They do charge interest. They just try to justify it. It's just the wordplay. They just try to justify the interest they charge with this and that excuse. In fact, today, if you go and get a loan from a bank, it would be for about 27% annual interest, which is, to my understanding, quite high. So they do still charge interest. They just call it something else to justify the Islamic title. And also, they have all the flaws of the fractional reserve banking. For those who aren't familiar with fractional reserve banking, let me explain how it works. In reserve banking, when you deposit your money in the bank lends the money to someone else and tells you that your money is safe with them. But then the person who receives the loan would deposit the money in another bank. For sake of the argument, let's say he deposits it in the same bank, and the bank lends that money again to someone else, and so on and so goes. And this happens so much so, if, for example, you deposit $1,000 and the bank keeps, and they usually keep some of the money, usually between 5 to 7%. But let's say if they kept 10% of the money, they would create about nearly $20,000 with your 1,000, because the bank lends 900 and the 900 comes back to the bank, and they lend the 810 and so on and so forth. And as you know, in the history of Islam, it is abundantly clear that the valuation of money is very un-Islamic and has been prohibited and has been rejected in almost all Muslim societies. But fractional reserve banking alone devalues the money, because the money supply goes up and the purchasing power of the money decreases over time. Another thing I can mention is the basic function of the banks. As I mentioned before, the usury was considered to be when a wealthy person, a powerful person, would lend small loans to weak people with cruel intentions and unreasonable rates, because they were forced to get those loans. They had no other means. So that would be called usury. But in the current system, they have turned it on its head. In fact, these days, average people would deposit their money to keep their purchasing power, because the money keeps devaluating. So they want to keep the purchasing power, so they deposit it in the bank. And who gets the loans? Usually the major shareholders, bigger institutions, connected institutions, politically connected institutions, especially in the case of government-owned banks. It is a joke in Iran that you cannot get a loan of 1 million, and if you want to get a small loan, 1 million, by the way, is a very small amount. If you want to get a small loan, you have to provide all the documents of all of your family members and so on and so forth. But we have many instances of the biggest loans are usually provided to big corporations, more politically connected people, and that sort of things. So in effect, weaker people are lending money to more powerful people, and they are not with the excuse of being Islamic and trying not to charge interest. In fact, what they do, and by the way, when you do not pay back your loan, and it counts over time, then you have to pay a penalty. But they have declared that penalty un-Islamic, so they wouldn't pay any penalty. In other words, big corporation close to, or big guy close to political institutions comes in, gets a big loan, and believe me, I am trying to speak softer. So big guy comes in, gets a loan, and never pays it back. And imagine that in a high inflation climate, which means that if you don't pay your loan for, say, 5 years, in 5 years, the money you took initially is worth probably 1% or 5% of the, for example, you get 100,000, 5 years later, that 100,000 is worth about 1,000. So, and you wouldn't pay penalty. Why? Because in Islam, you cannot charge interest or that sort of penalty, but in fact, it is the other way around. There are other things as well. I will just try to finish this. I think we are going a little over time. So pushing fuqaha and religious leaders into banking is not as good as it sounds. Why is it? Because first of all, fuqaha are traditionally concerned with the principles. They are not bureaucrats. And when you force them into details of regulations and that sort of things, they're not necessarily the best people to do the job. And what happens is that a lot of people, a lot of bureaucrats, a lot of people can take advantage of sort of all the problems that arises later, people would attribute that to the religious leaders. So now the banking system in Iran is failing. People attribute a big deal of that problems to religious leaders and to Islam. Well, in fact, Islam had nothing to do this scheme of banking. And if you look at it a little closer, you see, as I mentioned in a couple of examples, it is very much un-Islamic. It is very anti-Islamic. So it has weakened Islam in Iran a great deal, and it has reduced the influence of the religious leaders a great deal, I should say. And the last thing I'm going to mention, and I have written about this extensively, is that religious leaders are not necessarily good economists. And if you spend your whole life with the matters of religion, you cannot be as good an economist as someone who has spent his whole life, her whole life, studying economics. But in fact, uh, that is what's happening. And some of the religious leaders are trying to compete with economists and come up with new theories to compete with the Western theories of economics, which is, well, allow me not to get into that. So thank you. I hope it was useful up until here. I will just, if I may say one more thing. The question remains, I think, that what is appropriate Islamic banking, and if there is such a thing after all. I believe Islam, as I've talked about this before, and I've written about this quite a lot, that I think with certainty we can say that Islam is compatible with modern economics. And we can explore this, and we have been exploring this extensively. And it is a safe bet. It is safe to say that Islam. But trying to come up with new theories of economics from, trying to find socialism in Islam, trying to find liberalism in Islam, trying to find economics. Actually, I think it is not a good idea, and it is a dangerous idea because of the reasons I just mentioned. A lot of people will take advantage of that opportunity, as they have in Iran, which is supposed to be an ideal place for Islamic ideas. But as you see, a lot of destructive ideas come about and marketed, and people market those ideas as Islamic to cover their own shortcomings. And in effect, you damage Islam. You're not doing a favor to Islam by trying to do that sort of things. So, well, thank you. I'm sorry if I went a little too long.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mohamad. So I will trying to summarize few of Mr. Mohammad's points. So we had a glance at history of ideas in the contemporary Iran that lead to the relatively unique understanding of Islamic banking, monetary policy, and finance. At the same time, even though we just hover on the surface, still this step is important because otherwise the name and labels can be quite deceiving. As the Persians say, between my moon and the moon, there is quite a difference. The very same is true when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran in general and the Islamic banking in Iran in particular. And in addition, our speaker here also briefly touched upon the legislations that establish the so-called Islamic banking in Iran and the role of religious leaders for and against the notion. And then later in the presentation slide, I found that our speaker also talked about the descent from theological argument to study the performance of the Iranian Islamic banking, its challenges, and the result after nearly 4 decades of practice. It may be timely observation as the Islamic banking experiment in Iran draws to a less than stellar conclusion, at least in its current iteration, since the legislators are not known to profess defeat and close shops when one measly trial results in error. Well, yes, I think we can safely say that Mr. Muhammad have give a very briefly idea of or notion on Islamic banking in Iran. So, do we have any question from from participants in the webinar here? So,
I
the early
think
question.
there was a question.
Yeah. So the early
I
question
think
is.
there was a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, the early question is, are the banks in Iran state-owned or privately owned or a mixture of two?
Yes, there is, as I mentioned before, as of 15 years ago. So the revolution was 40 years ago, but as of 15 years ago, we have small private banks. The number of them isn't very numerous, so there aren't many, and they are relatively small, even though they have grown up uh, a great deal, but still. Uh, but most of the banks, biggest banks, are still owned by the government. And there is something to be said about the private banks. Most of the private banks are, because banking in Iran, ironically, heavily regulated. So in that climate, not everybody can can establish a bank. For example, you and I cannot go and establish a bank. Usually, only people closely related to the institution, the powerful institutions or government institutions, or with political influence, only they can establish or get the license to establish a bank. So even the private banks, most of them indirectly, again, are owned by the government or the, I should say, political institutions or yeah, political, I think institutions is a safe word as any.
Okay, so do we have any question more from the floor? Well, since we're still waiting question, let me ask something. Oh yeah, there. Please explain which kind of banks is better in Iran and can work better, private or government?
Oh, there is no question about that. The performance of the private banks exceeds many times. So the government banks are not really commercial banks, unfortunately. So they are big banks. They have a lot of assets. They have a lot of branches. So some of them have more than 3,000 or 4,000 branches. They have a lot of employees. For example, Milli Bank, or the first uh, government bank, has nearly 50,000 employees, but they don't have any. They don't show any profit. They just show loss, and one of the reason is that the government forces them to do non-profit uh, things. So the politician would tell the bank to give loan to this, give loan to that, and or for example, we want to support agriculture. Let's start giving loans to the farmers. Let's give loan to the car manufacturers, that sort of things. So, and they usually wouldn't give back their loans. And as I mentioned before, the money comes from people, average people, normal people. But for example, a big car manufacturer gets a big loan from people and doesn't give it back, and there's no penalty. So, and made the banking system virtually bankrupt. So the government-owned banks aren't really working at all. Meanwhile, the private banks are more agile, they are smaller, they had to compete with each other uh, to grab the new customers. People at the beginning, people would not trust them because people didn't know, they didn't have any reputation, so they had to compete very hard, and that made them resilient. And some of them failed. So in any case, they perform much better.
I see. Okay, we also have a question more on what were levels of inflation like before the Ahmadinejad government came to power?
Can you
Hello.
You hear me?
Yeah. Yeah. Somehow we can hear you a little bit.
Okay. I'm sorry, I just broke out for a second. Um, the kind of banks is can work, okay, and what were level of okay, the level of inflation reached well before Ahmadinejad, it was about 30%, 30 to 35%. But after that, it reached, according again to authorities who monitor this sort of things, and inflation isn't my specialty, I should point out. It reached hyperinflation status. So it was 100, 200, reached that amount. And the money devalued extensively. I think during Ahmadinejad era, the money, Iranian rial, was devalued about, if I'm not mistaken, 12 to 13 times over.
I see.
Rouhani, allow me to add that Rouhani government, the first term, they tried to control the inflation and they reduced inflation to even 16%, which was unprecedented for Iran. 16% inflation for us was great. But in the second term, he let go as well. And now we are facing somewhere near 80%. There are different indications, but I think it's a safe, 80% is a safe bet, if not more.
I see. So the next question is yeah, from Ali Hassan. Yeah, the question is, nowadays we observe growth of many banks in Iran, and then private more and more evolve, especially in the last decade. So it seems that in Iran we face with a bad system of banking. Do you agree? Does it mean that Iran must change its economic system or not?
Well, I think it is safe to say that Iran has to change its economic system. There's no way around it, and everyone knows this. About the banking system has not grown. I'm not sure where you get your information from. What is your source, I should say. But banks in the past decade have not grown a great deal, not more than before at least. And they have shown more and more loss. That is true. And their frozen assets have grown a great deal as well. But they haven't grown too much, especially our biggest banks. But yes, the banking system, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, the banking system isn't working and it is not a good banking system, and everyone agrees. Some of even most of people who would normally support this system, there are a lot of people, most of them politicians, would say that the system is good, have not been able to implement it very thoroughly. If we could implement it more thoroughly, the system would work flawlessly. So there are that sort of claims, but even they admit that the system as is currently is not working and is moving towards a disaster.
Okay. Do we have any more question?
Oh, you're
Okay.
welcome.
Uh, Let me ask something. Mr. Mohammed, I mean, we talk about Islamic banking, we talk about the role and some brief history of it. Uh, I mean, for me, I mean, at least in the case of Malaysia, we have seen how Islamic banking have grown since the 1980s until today, and I would foresee it somehow it resembles a little bit similar case with what happened in Iran, but of course we have a distinct feature to some extent.
I'm sorry, I cannot
My
hear
question
you.
is,
Can you please
hello,
repeat the
can you hear me?
question?
Yeah. So my question is, uh, when we talk about Islamic banking, do we really need the term Islamic when we do a product in a banking system? Do you get my question?
Yes, I do. And that is a very
Yeah.
good question, actually. I believe no, we do not need that title. Many countries don't need to make everything Islamic. We don't need Islamic psychology and English and
The sound is not clear. The sound is not clear from your side, Mr. Mohammed. No, no, we can't hear you. There is no sound coming out from your side, Mr. Mohammed.
well, oh, how about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, this is better. This is better.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Uh, I tried my best to resolve the issue. Okay.
It's okay.
So,
Yeah.
can you hear me now? Okay. So,
Yes, yes.
as I was saying, I do not think that we need to have the Islamic in the title of everything. We hear about Islamic psychology, for example, and we hear about Islamic astronomy. I don't think, and also the attempt to find socialism and liberalism in Islam, that sort of thing. Islam has been around before a lot of these and will be around after them. And these things come and go. Trends, for example, in economics, at the time when they were establishing the Islamic banking system in Iran, socialism was popular. Uh, Go back go forward 50 years, and something else will be popular. If we want to effectively, we are changing Islam to become favorable with the current trends. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think these trends come and go. And in economics, someday, as I mentioned before, someday it's socialism, someday it's Keynesianism, some it's Austrian economy. Behavioral these days is getting popular. And to try and mix religion with these trends, in my opinion, is a very bad idea. And I think we have a lot of evidence to support that.
Yes. I very agree. I'm totally agree with you. Somehow we are being too obsessed in Islamizing certain conventional knowledge, and myself is coming from International Islamic University from Malaysia. We are trying, I mean, they are trying very hard in finding or Islamizing all this conventional theory, conventional subject into Islam. I do foresee it as something that is not necessary as long as it is in line with what Islam believe in, and it is. I think that is fine. We don't necessarily need Islamic term in front of it. Okay, so there's more question. Comparing to the Western banking, what is the best model for Islamic countries, especially Iran?
Well, I think the conventional banking, the only thing I could, in my opinion, between conventional banking and the Islamic teachings of the Prophet is the only incompatibility I see is the fractional reserve banking. And well, that's a technical thing. I'm not sure if it's the right forum to talk about this, but briefly, um, in my opinion, fully reserve banking is more in line with the teachings of Islam, is more compatible with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And fractional reserve banking for many reasons. One of them is the devaluation of money. Another reason is that in some cases you get people's money as for Qazul Hasana, as for they are providing that money for from the goodness of their heart to help their uh, their fellow human beings, but you risk that money for profit in fractional reserves.
Hello?
So that is also not a good idea.
We start to cutting off the sound. Hello? Is the sound cut off again?
That's in the business people. So do you have a?
Yeah, just now we couldn't hear you just now.
Oh, okay. So let me be brief. I think the conventional banking works quite all right, and maybe just if I had to add something, I would say in Muslim countries should lean towards fully reserved banking rather than fractional reserve banking. I think that is more in line with the teachings of the Prophet.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mohamad. So do we have any question from the floor? Okay, if we don't have, so I might ask last question to our speaker here. So what do you foresee the future of Islamic banking, not only in Iran but in the whole world? Since Malaysia also having Islamic banking since 1980s, so what is your future prospect for Islamic banking, not only in Iran but throughout the world?
Well, I hope um, the trouble is that in the future these things can go their separate ways. By these two, I mean the conventional banking, the conventional economics, basically, and this monster we have created and named very. I don't think that's a good name, Islamic banking, for this schemes. But nevertheless, let's call it Islamic banking for sake of the argument. This thing can go its own way. We have done it for 40 years. We can do it for another 40 years. Other countries can do that, do the same if they digress from conventional banking, from conventional wisdom of economics. Uh, it can be damaging. It can be long-lasting ill effects, I think. And I would hope that people get instead of trying to replicate some sort of Islamic banking, in my opinion, we should focus on institutions like Ghazal Hasana. Personally, I'm working in a small charity. We do provide no interest loans and no interest micro loans, and it has been very successful. I think we should focus on this sort of things. These are more in line with the teachings of Islam. With these institutions, we can help our fellow human beings and better our societies. But with institutions like this monsters that we call Islamic banking, I don't think the future for them is very bright.
I'm totally agree with you, sir. I mean, I also have been talking with bankers, Islamic bankers. They told me that they need profit rate because that's how they survive in the financial institution. So there is like I would say a justification made by Islamic bankers saying that they need profit rate because if they don't have that, then how they can survive as a business itself. So this is a never-ending question. This is a never-ending problem, I would say. But yes, I do agree that Qadul Hasan is something that we should emphasize on Islamic banking because this is where we can use it to help the one that really need it in the economy. Okay, so Mr. Muhammad, do you have any final say on your topic here?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Do you have any final word on your
allow me to thank everyone who attended this webinar, and I will elaborate a little more on this topic in the upcoming conference in Islamabad in November. I hope I see you all there, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us in webinar, and I hope we can see you guys again in the next webinar. Thank you. Have a good day.